Welcome to the New Age Masonic Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the New Age magazine, predecessor to the Scottish Rite Journal. On this podcast, we take a deep dive into the articles of the history, people, and lessons of Freemasonry as written in the New Age magazine and their pertinence to both everyday, personal, and Masonic life. Hosted by brothers Maynard Edwards, 33rd degree, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree, and Chris Ruley, 32nd degree KCCH. Articles from the New Age magazine read by Matt Bowers and brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the world. Welcome to the New Age Masonic Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the New Age magazine, the predecessor to the Scottish Rite Journal. First published in 1904, the New Age magazine was. I am one of your hosts, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree, along with brother Chris Ruley, 32nd degree KCCH, historian for the Valley of DC, and one hell of a model American. Brother Ruley, how are you today?
Hello. I'm well. How are you doing? Model American.
I'm doing well. If you could see Chris, he's wearing a backwards baseball cap because he has a commandery meeting tonight and he didn't want to pretty up his hair.
Well, why am I going to gussy up my hair if I'm going to be in a chapeau all night?
Okay, so this article that we are doing today, Chris, give us the title and the author of the article, pretty please.
So this article comes from the 1993 edition of the New Age magazine, and it's called Albert Pike, Indian Attorney. It is by Paul M. Niebel, Sr., 33rd degree. He is a member of the Maryland and DC Scottish Rite bodies. I don't think I had the pleasure of meeting Brother Paul or illustrious Paul before. I think he passed on before I became a Mason. But
based on that picture, he looked to be, a man well into his senior years.
Indeed. And he actually has a really interesting history. He talks a little bit about it in the article. So let's dive into the article and then we'll get to it.
Excellent. Here's my reading of the article from September 1993 of the New Age magazine, Albert Pike, Indian Attorney. From 1836 to 1843, to make room for the expansion of the white settlements, both the Creek and Seminole Indians were removed by U.S. forces to land west of the Mississippi River to what was then called Indian Territory, now a part of the state of Oklahoma. The Creek Nation was uprooted from its ancestral home in Alabama as a result of the so-called Creek War of 1836, and the Seminole Nation was removed from its tribal land in Florida as a result of the Second Seminole War, which lasted from 1835 to 1843. The Seminoles were relocated to the lands of the Creek Nation in Indian Territory because the United States believed that the blood ties and customs of the Seminoles, so similar to those of the Creek Nation, would eventually lead to the assimilation of the Seminole Nation into the larger Creek Nation. Although the Seminole Nation was assigned to a separate part of the Creek lands, difficulties between the two nations soon developed and continued for years. The Seminoles had developed their own laws, which conflicted with those of the Creeks, and they demanded their freedom from the Creek Nation so that they could pursue their separate ways. In December 1855, to solve the many conflicts between the two Indian nations, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, George W. Manypenny, directed each tribe send delegates to Washington to resolve the conflicts by securing from the Creek Nation a separate area for the Seminoles, thus assuring its complete separation from the Creek Nation. In his annual report to the Secretary of the Interior, dated November 26, 1853, Commissioner Manypenny wrote, "There is no absolute necessity for the employment by Indian tribes of attorneys or agents to attend to their business at the seat of government. In the dependent condition of the Indians, it is the duty of the government, as their guardian, to cause all matters of a business character with them to be so conducted as to preclude the necessity of the intervention of this class of persons." Both the Creek and Seminole nations had outstanding claims against the United States, which they hoped would be settled along with the Seminoles' territorial question in any treaty or other arrangement to be made with the United States. To assist them in presenting their tribal claims against the United States, they employed Albert Pike, an outstanding lawyer of Washington, D.C. at the time. Knowing that the Commissioner of Indian Affairs disparaged the use of lawyers in handling such tribal matters, the letters addressed by the delegates to the Commissioner were in the handwriting of Albert Pike, but were signed only by the delegates of the respective tribes. Both Creek and Seminole delegates, in May 1856, initiated their negotiations with the Commissioner of Indian Affairs by presenting their respective tribal claims for settlement. The Creek delegates presented 9 separate claims totaling $3,700,000 against the United States. One of these, the Fort Jackson Treaty Claim of 1853, had been reported favorably upon both houses of Congress, as well as Manipenny's predecessor in office, and was valued at $1,769,940. Also, the Seminoles presented their claims regarding the Florida Aboriginal lands taken from them under duress in 1823 and 1832. The Commissioner advised the delegates that it was not his intention to settle their individual claims, but instead to negotiate a settlement of the entire Seminole question. The delegates replied that if they made a treaty without settling their outstanding claims, the United States would hold that they had waived their claims. In his letter of June 25, 1856, the Commissioner strongly attacked what he called their alleged claims and supposed wrongs. He stated that the claims of the delegates were without merit and generally not well-founded. He especially attacked the Fort Jackson Treaty Claim of the Creek Nation, which his predecessor in office had approved, and instead recommended that Congress pay the Creek Nation $1,769,880 for lands in Alabama and Georgia taken from the Creeks during duress. The Commissioner raised so many technical objections to the Fort Jackson Treaty Claim of the Creeks that only an experienced lawyer could adequately answer them. Fortunately, Albert Pike not only knew the language of the Indians, but he was also familiar with the facts pertaining to the Fort Jackson Treaty Claim of the Creek Nation, for, as attorney for the Creeks, he had, in March 1856, filed a petition in the United States Court of Claims settling forth the true facts and law involved in this claim. Pike's eloquent and thorough answer to the Commissioner's objections to this Creek claim of June 30th, 1856, consumed 53 pages of his careful and distinctive handwriting. Signed only by the Creek delegates, it read in part, "Your view is that the Creek Nation was one, that the war was waged by the Union against the United States, that the individual Creeks only fought for the latter, and that General Jackson took the land in question as land of the conquered nation. Our view is that the Creeks were a confederacy of distinct tribes, speaking different languages, a mere league and not strictly a nation, that the Lower Creeks and not the Confederation owned the lands in question, that the war was waged by part of the tribes of the Confederacy against the others, and against the authority of the Lower and Upper Creeks and against the United States, by which war the Confederacy was at once dissolved, that the Lower Creeks were not conquered, nor was the Creek Nation conquered, and that General Jackson did not and could not take these lands by virtue of the right of conquest, or as the property of a conquered people. We do not think it is too much to say that the whole history of the nation and all the evidence sustains our construction." Then, in a letter of July 5, 1856, the Creek delegates stated that they were prepared to receive a liberal offer to settle the Seminole question and all matters of claims against the United States. After reading the Creek delegates' letter and Pike's classic treatise on the facts and law of the Fort Jackson Treaty Claim of the Creeks, the Commissioner offered them $700,000 as a liberal offer for the lands of the Seminoles and all of their claims. The Creek delegates rejected this offer, stating that one claim alone was valued by his predecessor in office and the House Committee on Indian Affairs of the Congress at $1,769,940, and to compromise their valid claims for $700,000, and for the cession of land for the Seminoles would admit that their claims were wholly unfounded, an admission which we can never make. The commissioner then offered them $800,000. The Creek delegates rejected this offer in their letter of July 28, 1856, stating that a larger number of senators urged the Secretary of the Interior to pay them $1 million. They continued saying, "Permit us to say that you commit a very grave error if you imagine that we are not entirely confident of the merits and justice of our claims. We are playing no game whatsoever and have but one tongue and one face. We feel that less than $1.5 million is less than our nation ought in good conscience to be asked to receive upon a fair compromise. We shall always think so, and so will our people. We have submitted to take less, as men must ever submit to what they cannot resist." The Treaty of August 7, 1856, 11 Statute 699, followed the foregoing negotiations. The Creek Nation therein ceded to the United States 2,037,414 acres of land as a country for the Seminoles in the eastern part of Oklahoma, and the release of their claims totaling $3,700,000 for a total consideration of $1 million. In this transaction, Albert Pike was dealing with an arbitrary public official, yet he was able to raise the amount secured for the Creek Nation from $700,000 to $1 million. Despite this gain for the Indians, the Treaty of 1856 was unconscionable. In this transaction, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, although trustee of the Indian tribes, had the duty to deal fairly and honorably with them, but he cheated the Creek and Seminole nations out of the true value of their lands ceded in the treaty as well as the fair amount due them for their valid claims. The commissioner determined their claims to be worthless and generally not well-founded. How unjust was the Treaty of 1856? In later Indian claims cases, in which I was attorney for the Creek and Seminole nations, the courts of the United States, based largely upon that classic treatise of Albert Pike, entered a judgment in the Fort Jackson Treaty case for the Creek Nation in the amount of $3,913,000. For the lands ceded by the Creek Nation for the Seminoles, a judgment was entered for the Creek Nation in the amount of $1,037,414, in addition to the $1 million paid them in the treaty. For two other Creek claims, judgments were entered in the total amount of $9,064,427.92. For the Seminole Nation, a judgment was recovered for them in the amount of $16 million for their Florida lands taken from them under duress. Probably none of this would have been possible if Albert Pike had not had a central role in the original filing of the Indian claims. His knowledge of the Indians, his legal expertise, and his keen sense of justice gained benefits for the Creek and Seminole nations at that time and, just as importantly, set a precedent which, ultimately, resulted in a much more equitable resolution of the original Indian claims. I am proud to have had some part in this final outcome. Also, as a Scottish Rite Mason, it gives me special pleasure to know I have followed in the tradition of Albert Pike who, as an attorney for the Indians, took the first significant steps needed to assure equity and justice for all. Okay, we're back. Myself, Matt Bowers, 32nd Degree, along with Brother Chris Rulli, 32nd Degree KCCH. This to me was a really interesting read. It made me think a little bit, obviously, of the Scorsese movie that was out. What was it, late last year, early this year? You know, some of the goings on with that, and you know, taking advantage of the Native American tribes, and you know, reading this, how Pike got involved. And one of the things that stuck out to me, you know, today, whether it's on buses, TV, radio, we are absolutely inundated with, "Do you need a lawyer type of
Right.
ad.
Right.
None of these mediums were available during this time, obviously. And I didn't see anything specifically that stated how Pike got involved. How did it happen? Was it through word of mouth or through his previous tribal involvements? Because he was heavily involved with Indian tribes.
So this article by Brother Paul is certainly different from the other articles that we read before. This sort of goes into one theme or one topic in great detail. A lot of the stuff that we've covered before has been really broad, really focused on masonry. Here is an example of, going beyond that and going, well, I'm curious about Albert Pike, who's already this sort of large figure. Most Masons, I would argue, probably know more about Pike as his stuff in the Supreme Council, the things that he wrote. And so this covers a part of his life before the Civil War, before becoming Grand Commander, where he is focused in his what Bob Davis out of Oklahoma would say his primary profession, which Albert Pike was a lawyer. And so, if you look at Pike's history, or if you look at his biography, he was a guy that was born in the North, Massachusetts, came and traveled out west early part of his life for hunting, for travel, expedition, excursions, and he effectively fell in love with the western boundaries, the western part of the United States,
Mm-hmm.
the territories, adventure seeking, hunting, meeting different tribes. And so through that, yeah, and Pike was a teacher. I mean, he started his professional life teaching, but then he quickly found that he was interested in other things or pursuing other things.
Right.
So he left, he went out west, as I said before. And so he engaged with many of these indigenous tribes during this early part of his life. He learned the languages, he learned how to engage with them, and then he smartly found ways that he could do business with them. And so one of the things that he did is when he moved back, he sort of started his main profession. He moved to Arkansas.
Mm-hmm.
He first got a job, or he actually purchased a newspaper and was serving as an editor of the newspaper, an old newspaper. He just took on the newspaper as editor. And then afterwards he went into law, got his law degree, and then passed the bar, and then went back and started to work with these indigenous tribes. And so what Paul introduces are these things called land or claims to the government on behalf of many of these indigenous tribes. And so what he's really doing is during this time, the American government its relationship with the indigenous tribes is tenuous at best.
Mm-hmm.
All these treaties, all these sort of arrangements that the government had with, the sort of major, Bob Davis calls them the civilized tribes.
Right.
Actually, by the way, Bob wrote a really great article about this topic. So if you want a good primer on this topic, but that involves more about Albert Pike's history with these tribes, take a look at Herodom Volume 17. I think it's a 2009 edition. Bob covers some of this and more. And so what he says is, look, he was a lawyer. He engaged with these indigenous tribes. These tribes were basically in a constant battle with the federal government. They made these treaties decades earlier, right? They basically evicted from their homes, their ancestral territories, moved to Oklahoma, moved to the western part of the country. The government said, well, wait a minute, we'll pay you, we'll reimburse you for all these land. And by the way, these are millions of acres of territory. But here's the problem, and Bob even acknowledges it. It's not acknowledged in Paul's work, but Brother Davis mentions it. Leadership in Washington changes. They don't seem to keep the treaties. There's confusion over the details. There's long distances in terms of communication, like logistically back and forth with these territories.
And I could see that being probably that right there, just being the biggest issue on the surface. It's like, how long are you waiting to find out before somebody's, handling this? Is it months? Is it years? Is it
Months,
days? Months.
years,
Yeah.
Months and years. And so
by the time you find out, they've already got something else in motion, quite potentially working against them.
or new congressmen or new leaders are elected, and so you get this sort of like recurring, wait, what, we have to go back to square one and go, well, actually,
Right.
I haven't had a chance to read this, so I've got to go back, and so there's this idea of it's in this constant loophole. And so Pike is one of these lawyers. In fact, he eventually becomes a principal lawyer on behalf of some of these indigenous tribes, certainly the Chickasaw tribe, and I believe the Choctaw tribe as well,
Mm-hmm.
where he is their lawyer in Washington, bringing up these land cases, saying, hey, listen, you promised us X amount of dollars for all this land in those territories that you took from us, and we only received half of that, or a quarter of that, or a third of that. And
Mm-hmm.
so he's making these claims, and in this example, in Paul's article, Paul highlights one very important case that effectively becomes sort of like precedent in American jurisprudence, where it's Pike's words, Pike's actions, Pike's decisions, and his writings on this case that effectively lead to, I think it was adjusted for inflation, $3 million worth of monies going back to these indigenous tribes. And so this is certainly, and I'll end it here, this is certainly a unique sort of part in Pike's life, where he sees himself as an opportunity to serve those who are not being represented,
Right.
in local government. They're through, because of cultural issues, through, quite frankly, racism and
Right.
these differences between, state and federal jurisdictions. He's basically taking this opportunity to help these indigenous tribes recoup the money from the government.
Well, and thinking of real quick, just the money aspect, $3 million. I mean, it's not chump change today, but back then, what was $3 million worth? That
A lot of
was
money.
a lot of money. Not that it isn't now. By $3 million, I could certainly stretch out $3 million for the rest of my life and live pretty well. I would do okay with that. But back then, that was that's like a big class action lawsuit that you read about for tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, for sure.
Yeah, and towards the end of his article, Paul mentions that, combined, these treaties, I think Pike was involved in around 9 million. I think you mentioned it during in the article,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly we're talking big money.
Yeah.
We're talking huge sort of claims, but we're also talking about a guy like Pike who is working through the system, trying to find ways to get what he believes are, reparations for these unjust acts by the federal government by seizing these territories,
Right.
and trying to get this money back from people. So I think he is seeing that this is a good cause to fight for,
Right.
and he really embeds himself in the territory. He embeds himself with the people. He serves as their representative in Washington. He travels back and forth. He engages with them. There's a great story actually in Pike's autobiography of him having a discussion with Sam Houston. Sam Houston, representative of Texas at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Houston's basically telling Pike, hey, listen, I can't support these, actions or vote for, claims, because it would show or confirm that, the government was, inept or not doing its job.
Right.
And there's more on that, of course, if you read his autobiography or read Bob Davis's article, which is very good, Inheritum, and you'll learn more about that. But again, the idea is Pike is doing something before the war, right? Before the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
He is cutting out his claim, and he is becoming a notable figure in law, in Arkansas law and federal law associated to these claims.
And thinking of him as a lawyer, and one of the lines in the article that really, really stuck out to me, and it made me think that, that the government was trying to get over on a group of people that they, like you said, they uprooted from their homes and their ancestral lands and moved them to another area. And one of the lines, I quote, the commissioner and the federal government disparaged the use of lawyers in handling such tribal matters. Thinking of lawyers, what was Pike's overall reputation as a lawyer before this and after? And maybe not just with his reputation with the government, but obviously there were newspaper articles published about this. What was his reputation like?
Well, I would, based on my understanding of Pike's early law career, he effectively focused most of his attention on these native, indigenous claims.
So he started doing that. Okay.
Well, he may have worked in, I unfortunately I just don't have access to Arkansas
Sure.
court. I can't
But
necessarily.
it wasn't a situation like I use for example, not to interrupt you. Sorry, use a situation. We'll say the movie Philadelphia and Denzel Washington's character, the lawyer that he plays in that is something of an ambulance chaser.
Right.
And,
No,
and he gets involved pretty much because he's the last man standing in a major case with his client, Tom Hanks, who's dying from AIDS, and he's suing his firm. Pike didn't start off in I don't know, I don't want to say lower level law, but with something like that in the beginning.
Well, so based on the research, and again, I don't have access to Arkansas court claims, but I'm sort of safe to say that Pike really made his case, his career through bringing up these claims for indigenous peoples, indigenous tribes.
And to move a little further with it, thinking of some of the things that have gone on legally in the media today, something like this, because probably the only media you had at the time were newspapers and local newspapers, and how did the information and how accurately did the information travel? Something like this could have been spun in a million different ways. Was this major news that was spread throughout the country, and was it received well by people?
Well, I think if you look at contemporary newspapers, you start to see that Pike has now established, when you are successful with one tribe, start to see that Pike is now being, asked or pulled in on different claims for different tribes. And so even in Paul's article, you see that he's not just dealing with, one of the 5 major tribes. He's dealing with multiple tribes.
Yeah.
He's working with different groups. And so you can certainly tell that he becomes Pike for a period of time becomes a national expert on these types of claims. And so if there were other, indigenous groups or territories that are wishing to file claims, going for a guy like Albert Pike would certainly be a smart move.
Here's one that stuck out with me too, because he was helping a minority in the country at the time, for sure. And the untrue claim that Pike was involved with the KKK. We all know that's inaccurate. And like I said, in this article, he's clearly acting on behalf of a minority. He was well compensated for this, I'm sure. But why is his positive effect on the outcome on the tribes versus the government often overlooked? Is it just because it sounds cool or it sounds dark and mean to make him say because he was part of the Klan, where I'm aware of some of that nonsense regarding it? You could probably shed some better light on it.
Yeah. So I want to make a distinction here. I think what we're talking about are two different things. Pike's relationship with or alleged relationship with the KKK, to me, has very little bearing on, or at least a connection to, the question of what was Pike's relationship with indigenous tribes during the Civil War. So during the Civil War, because of his success bringing these land claims to the government and securing rights, the indigenous tribes in Arkansas and around the country saw him as an expert. Now, there also happens to be, as part of this, when the Civil War erupts and when Pike chooses to defend his livelihood, his business, his work is in the South, he chooses the Confederate side. He is seen, and Jefferson Davis, President Jefferson Davis, makes him the commissioner of the Confederate, department that engages with the indigenous tribes. And so he serves as a diplomatic envoy, I guess you would say, to these tribes. He establishes, right, because now with the dissolution of or at least the secession of many of these states, we now have these Indian territories without any treaties. And so one of Pike's first things that he does is he engages with these territories and said, okay, those treaties are now considered void.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have to set up new treaties with the Confederate government. And he basically goes through the process of setting up these treaties. And during that time, through these negotiations, through this back and forth with the new Confederate government,
Right.
he establishes a negotiation or an agreement where many of these tribes will fight for the Confederacy. And so he becomes a general that basically oversees, or his troops are many of those individuals who are in these tribes, these
Right.
indigenous tribes. And so he then, in his new position as general, or brigadier general, excuse
Mm-hmm.
me, he engages in his first and only attack or battle at Pea Ridge, or the Battle of Pea Ridge.
Right.
And so this is where we get this idea of this, this atrocity at Pea Ridge, the scalping activities.
Mm-hmm.
And so Pike is disappointed that this occurred. He's, in fact, if you see the writings, if you see some of the contemporary work, while he's labeled as a monster and everything in Northern press, of course, that makes sense. You would be labeled as a monster in the Northern press. But he is very disappointed at the outcome. He court-martials one of the individuals.
Mm-hmm.
He makes a general rule that this type of engagement is uncivil. It's demeaning. There is sort of it's called a sort of code of conduct. Right. Is unbecoming of a warrior, and so he makes an attempt to fix this issue. Pike doesn't serve in the military for too long, and I think he only lasts as because of other issues. In fact, it's according to the Confederate documents or Confederate paperwork, I think he's charged for financial mishandling of documents or
right.
financial mishandling of monies, and so he leaves the Confederacy. He resigns. And so his term in the Confederacy, his term with, indigenous troops is very small, very tenuous, and very brief. And so the connection, I sort of have a problem when people say, well, he may have been in the KKK, he may have been the Ku. There's no evidence for that.
Right.
Bedford Forrest, who I believe is what is it called, the Grand Master or the Grand Dragon of the
whatever.
KKK.
Yeah.
That first, remember the KKK went through 3 or 4 different organizations or different groups.
Mm-hmm.
The first KKK, that original group of former Confederate soldiers,
right,
that did not exist over time. The federal government effectively destroyed it and killed off that group. They were either imprisoned or they were, it dissolved. When these individuals were arrested, they were asked to name names, to identify other major conspirators, other members of the organization,
right.
And a single individual, Bedford Forrest or any of these other individuals named Albert Pike, who was a relatively rich, very prominent in his, social circles, certainly not an unknown. So none of those individuals named Albert Pike as a member of the KKK.
Right.
Could he have been a member? That's not within the context of this discussion. We're talking about, the indigenous troops or his relationship to the indigenous peoples. So again, I want to really button that and make sure that what we're talking about here is his relationship with the indigenous tribes, his claims, which were very successful against the United States government to get these individuals or tribes paid and their debts and issues recognized.
Well, what made me think of what even sparked the whole idea of the KKK was just the fact that this article can go in 9 million different directions with Pike's history and government history and Indian history. Like I asked, what was Pike like as a lawyer just in general? What was the government's take on indigenous tribes or minorities in general? News media, types of lawyers, anything like that. And that's the main reason why, because he was helping out a minority, it just It makes me wonder why people, if they knew this information, why they would even think for a second that he was involved with something like the Klan.
Well, the Pea Ridge situation did not help his case. And
Okay.
so he was very embarrassed and very distraught, and it sort of kept with him after the war. You know,
Sure.
it's sort of these sort of things like PTSD.
Mhm.
Think of all these, you know, not trivial, excuse me, they're actually very dangerous to one's health.
Right.
And so I think Pike could never escape, at least in northern newspapers. You know, he could never escape this association with Pea Ridge, and he was disappointed by the association. He was angry, and just frustrated that his name would be tied to that. Why is that? Well, think of all the other success. Imagine you were a successful lawyer. You brought a precedent-setting case to the Supreme Court or the federal courts. You helped, you know, these Native American or indigenous tribes. And so all of a sudden you make one decision, and that decision, you know, unfortunately labels you for the rest of your life. And so I think he has a tough time balancing that. It's Pike's own, you know, he has to find a way of doing that. And again, his law practice, here's the other thing we don't talk about.
Mm-hmm.
He moves to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1869. He still maintains his law practice. He has a law practice with his son back in Arkansas. He sets up another branch in D.C. with a colleague named Robert W. Johnson. And so they are modestly successful in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, they really, these Native American indigenous tribe cases are really the only things that they're focused on. They become too specialized, and he really abandons his law practice in the next 5 or 6 years.
Right.
And so then he focuses mostly on Freemasonry. The Supreme Council pays for his, he gets a stipend from the Supreme Council, a living wage.
Mm-hmm.
He lives at the House of the Temple, the first House of the Temple. And so he basically falls back on the fraternity for assistance, for monies, for support, and he becomes a professional Freemason after that. He engages in social activities. He meets with people who are involved. He stays connected with his old friends back in Arkansas and Masons throughout the country. But in the most part, his law career effectively fizzles out about 5 or 6 years after he arrives in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War. So this is, the summer of 1869. So we'll say about 1873, 1874, his law practice is effectively fizzling out. Right.
This is the first article that we've done that, like I said, I think it could have been discussed in a multitude of directions. I like that about it. It could have gone here, there, everywhere, and you could have a lengthy conversation about any of it, really.
Yeah. I mean, to me, making a connection and saying, well, Albert Pike was involved in, these nefarious groups like the KKK because he was connected, because he served in the Confederacy for, 8 or 9 months.
Right.
I think is sloppy history.
Sure.
You need to really look at the full picture. Now, then again, I want to claim I'm not a Pike apologist. I certainly don't agree with Pike's decision to join the Confederacy. I certainly, if it is true that Pike was somehow involved in the Pea Ridge massacre with scalping and all this stuff, then that's very disappointing. I certainly don't support what he did.
Right.
I do, however, think that before the war, his attention to detail, his earnest, zealous approach to trying to address the concerns of the indigenous tribes, to make sure that these individuals who did not have good representation had good representation. I think that's admirable. Like in anything in history, like anything in life, you can't just focus on one thing that one person did in one part of their life. You must look at the entire person, the entire whole, to get the full context.
For sure.
So I think Brother Paul does a great job in highlighting in this article a unique moment in Albert Pike's life where he set precedent, he established himself well, and he made the author, Brother Paul, very proud to be a lawyer through his work and his good work.
Right.
And I think any student of history, when you're writing something, when you're reading something, when you're trying to understand a person, I think this is a good example of not just highlighting the bad stuff, looking at the good stuff and trying to see the whole picture.
Well, cool. Well, any other parting thoughts there, Chris?
No, thank you for this article. I hope brethren find it as interesting as I did. I think it was a very technical piece, right? He was going into the nuances of what was going on and how it, this is a good example of telling a story. It's a little technical. It's not about esotericism. It's not about, all the interesting things that Pike wrote. But it was a nice indication, a nice clear-cut example of why Pike got to where he was,
right?
How he got to where he does, the successes in his life that brought him eventually to the Supreme Court, to federal courts, and then back to Washington, D.C. after the Civil War to continue his job.
I'd be curious to know how many rewrites this article might have gone through to condense some of the information. Because like you said, it's pretty complex. There's a lot of meat in there, even for the short time that it is.
Right.
So, well, thank you everyone for listening to the New Age Masonic podcast. This podcast was brought to you by the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. I am one of your hosts, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, along with Brother Chris Ruley, 32nd degree KCCH, historian for the Valley of DC. And we will see you next time here at the New Age Masonic Podcast.